We're here with Yann Martel, the Spanish-Canadian author best known for his award-winning and best-selling novel Life of Pi, which sold millions of copies around the world. Good morning, welcome to the show. Could you talk to us about your involvement here at the Sharjah International Book Fair? You held a session speaking about the art of observation. What is the value of that and how does it factor in your work?
Sure. Well, as I said, this is my first time at the Sharjah Book Fair, and unfortunately it's my first time. This first time is virtual. It would be better to be there in person. It is a massive book fair. I love going to book fairs. So this time I did an interview with Porter Anderson. I forget what the session was called, but it was about my books, and it was a very good one. He asked terrific questions. Here I am in Canada. In fact, during the worst snowstorm we've had in 20 years where I live. Porter was in Florida, and you guys are in Sharjah, so it's amazing. This connections made internationally. One of the things I talked about was the art of observation. I think not just art, but certainly art starts with observation, and specifically, I think a steady gaze. To get something out of something, you have to look at it for a while. You have to look at it steadily. And then you start seeing things, maybe, if you are observant, if you're actually open to what you're looking at. And I think all art starts like that, with either an open ear, an open eye, a steady sense of observation to see what things really are like. So not just affected by passing influences, passing emotions, but if you look at it steadily, any emotion will tend to settle. And then you have a mixture of intellectual observation and emotional attuneness. And I think it's those together that start creating something worthwhile, whether it's a work of art or just an intelligent observation about what you're looking at.
Is the ability to observe something that you could hone and develop, or is it strictly something you're born with, you either have it or you don't?
Well, I wouldn't particularly know. I think, to a certain extent you have to be born with it. There are art forms that lend themselves to slightly shorter span of attention. Rock music, pop music, a 3-minute rock song demands probably less steady focus than a 500-page novel, for example, or a great symphony orchestra, a great symphony. But I think people who gravitate towards the art, or perhaps towards science too, maybe innately have a certain steadiness in their gaze. But then other things come into play. It's not just about innate ability. I think often art is portrayed as sort of, a bolt of lightning strikes the artist and they madly write, and 2 weeks later you have a 200-page novel. I don't think that's quite the way it works. There's a lot of hard work. In my case, for example, I do a lot of research. I have an idea, of course, and then I work on that idea. I sort of think about it, and then I start doing research. I start reading, perhaps traveling, and that gives me more ideas. And those ideas give me more avenues of research. And so it goes back and forth between ideas and research. So that involves a lot of work. So yes, you have to have a certain ability, whether it's innate or acquired. You have to have a certain ability. But then it's a lot of hard work. I mean, nothing comes without hard work. I suppose there is the odd genius who just dashes something off, but those are few and far between. They get maybe all the attention. But otherwise, like everyone else, you just need to work really hard.
You're primarily a novelist. Could you talk to me about the novel as an art form? What drew you into it, and why write novels?
Well, that's an interesting, because that probably is something that's innate. I think a lot of writers, when I started writing, I wrote shorter things. So my first published book was a collection of short stories. But even within that collection, they get longer as you go along. And the final short story, in fact, is more of a novella. It's about 70, 80 pages long. So it seems that just naturally for me, the short story was too tight a format. To me, a short story is like a Swiss watch. It's very, very compact. Every little part counts. I found that maybe oddly too much pressure. Whereas a novel, you have more time. Not that a novel you can do what you want. You still have to work. You have to calibrate every word in a novel. But just the longer format, you can settle into things, naturally suited me. So I haven't written a short story in years and years, and I've written novels. I think it's just a format that suits me. In part because it's so powerful. A novel, unless you're a speed reader, it takes several days. And if people are busy with work and family, maybe several weeks or even months sometimes to read a novel. That means you settle into it, you live with it. And that means you really inhabit it. And I think it makes it extraordinarily powerful because what's wonderful about the written word, and it's not a competition here with the other art forms, is the written word does so much with so little. Writing is just these little squiggles on the page. Roman characters, Arabic characters, they're just little squiggles on the page. And you have to look at them and create what they say. So in a sense, when you're reading, you're creating a movie in your mind. And because you are doing it, you're not the director. The words tell you what to see in a sense, but you're everything else. You're the actor, you do the set design, you do the lighting. You're the one who says cut when it's time to stop reading. So you co-create the story, and when you involve yourself, that means you value it more because you are involved. So a great novel is incredibly powerful, and it does change people's lives. People read texts that then change the directions of their lives, change how they see life. So it is very, very powerful.
You talked about the reader as a co-author, and this is a pretty interesting thing to talk about because a lot of times, particularly here at the Sharjah International Book Fair, we've seen readers ask authors, what did you mean by this? And it's almost as if a lot of readers value the author's intent above all else in their interpretation of the work. So I'd like to ask you, is this something that you've thought about, authorial intent? Where do you stand on that as far as the reader's interpretation is concerned?
The question of interpretation is a fascinating one because yes, for sure, authors have a particular intent. They have something in mind. But that's what's so wealthy. I mean, if it was a very specific point, then novels would not be interesting. I mean, and some novels, like for example, some didactic or political novels, Uncle Tom's Cabin, for example, a novel about slavery, its intent was very clearly to show that it was dehumanizing to enslave a person. Well, once you got that, it's not necessarily a very interesting novel. A truly great novel lends itself to many, many interpretations, depending on what you bring to it. And you're right, some of them go beyond the author's intent. But it would be surprising even something like Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe had one intent. But, you could still read it with a variety of meanings possibly. But if you read it and said, okay, great, I'm going to go buy myself 3 slaves, you've clearly misunderstood it. So, you can read with a degree of liberty, but it'd be surprising if you went directly opposed to the author's intent. I'll give you a very good funny example, actually. My father is a writer too, he's a poet. And recently he wrote a wonderful text about a man who has a painting. And it's he didn't paint it, but he has a painting. And then people in the village come to see this painting. And it becomes quite a thing. And it's a 2-3 paragraphs of poetic prose. And at the end of it, he says, I'm going to now go into the forest to paint myself. Now, my father writes in French. French is my mother tongue. And to paint in French is peindre, P-E-I-N-D-R-E, peindre. And in fact, I misread the word. The word was P-E-N-D-R-E. There's no I. And P-E-N-D-R-E in French is to hang yourself. So in fact, my father wrote, says, I'm going to go into the forest now and hang myself. But I read it as I'm going to go into the forest and paint myself. And because it has to do with the painting, I thought, what a good, interesting idea to go into the forest, in other words, to hide yourself from the world and paint yourself, to, in a sense, I thought, recreate yourself. So I misread that final word, but it was all fine because it seemed to suit what the rest of the text said. So here I creatively reread the text in a way that still felt to me very rich, even though in fact I misunderstood it. So I think translated books, for example, you necessarily lose something from the original language, but something else is gained from the new language. And as I said, you bring something to it as a writer. So I have no problems. I mean, Life of Pi, for example, the book of mine that did the best, I get all kinds of interesting interpretations. One woman said, your story's about a boy who's in a lifeboat with the tiger. He feeds the tiger, cleans up after the tiger, and the tiger says goodbye without saying, leaves without saying goodbye at the end of the novel. Is this a metaphor on marriage? Now, I never thought of that, but I could see how it would fit. I mean, a story in a lifeboat is a very domestic drama. Here's a boy who takes place of a sullen tiger. It could be like a sullen husband. This is not an interpretation I had in mind, but it kind of fit. So I'm quite happy for people to interpret books any which way they want. The only objection would be it makes absolutely no sense if they're really reading in bad faith. But otherwise, that's exactly what a novel is like. It invites you on a trip. But you can look left or right. You can think. You can daydream whatever you want. You really are co-creating it. So that's what makes a novel so wealthy, is the liberty with which you can interpret it.
Could you talk to us more about your upcoming novel, Son of Nobody? How did it come about?
Yeah, Son of Nobody, which I just sent off to my editors a few days ago, is inspired by the Trojan War, which was mainly written about by Homer's Iliad, which was this epic war around allegedly around 2,000 years BCE, so about 3,000 years ago, between the Greeks and the Trojans. All these celebrated characters, Achilles, Hector, Paris, Helen, Menelaus, Agamemnon, this massive war, like the First World War in Europe, this epical war that changed the world. I read the Iliad recently, a few years ago. I'd never actually read it. I'd read about the Trojan, but I never actually read that big old classic. And I started reading it thinking it might be a dull tome, that it's been around for so long that by now it's kind of, didn't work quite as well as it might have at the time. In fact, not at all. In a good translation, it blew me away. And so my next novel, Son of Nobody, is inspired by it. It's the story of a scholar who discovers a lost Trojan War tradition called the Soad, featuring a soldier named Soaz, who's just a common foot soldier. In the Iliad, there's only a single commoner who speaks. Otherwise, it's entirely kings and princes and nobles who speak. In the Soad, it's a commoner named Soaz. So it's a perspective of the Trojan War from the view of a commoner, of a grunt. And things happen to him. He meets people, and this scholar only finds these fragments. So it's a novel that's in fragments on the top half of the page, and on the bottom half you have footnotes that flesh out part of what's in the fragments, but tell other stories too. So it's a novel in two voices, in fragments and in verses, and inspired by the Trojan War. So I'm really excited about it. Actually, it's come together in a really beautiful way, I feel. So I'm quite excited about it. But it won't be out for a while. It's only going to come out probably in the spring of 22 in English.
Could you tell me more about the style of the book? I find it pretty interesting. You're mixing fragments with verses and footnotes. How did you make those choices?
It's funny, when you have an idea, it's kind of like a baby. I have 4 children. Your baby is born and you're the father and you know the mother. You expect the child to be a certain way, but children just have their own way of being and of seeing the world and being in the world. It's kind of the same way with an idea. I had this idea and it just naturally expressed itself as needing to be in these two formats. So the top half are in verse, a loose imitation of the dactylic hexameter, which is how the Greek epic used to be written. But I couldn't just have it like that, because I needed to get out of it to look at it, and said, well, if you have these fragments, the best way to get out of it would be to have some sort of commentary by someone. I said, well, why not be a scholar, and then the footnotes. So what I like about it, it allows me a dialogue. The fragments are, let's say, the past, or fiction. The footnotes would be the present, would be nonfiction. So I have 2 different modalities, 2 different voices: past, present, fiction, nonfiction. The fragments are very, like Homer, very action-packed, lots of violence, lots of fights. So that's irrationality. The footnotes are an attempt to understand that, so that's rationality. So it allowed me a nice sort of dialogue between the two. And for the reader, I think it allows a nice changing of gear, sort of like driving a manual car up in a hilly landscape. You have to sort of change gear between the fragments and the footnotes. And the footnotes also, as I say, tell their own story. The scholar's relationship is falling apart. It's a very obvious parallel with the war, is a couple falling apart, a divorce. So there's sort of 2 parallel strands, and they echo each other very nicely. So it just kind of arose, you just sort of say, what do I try this? Oh, this works. And you keep on pursuing that. And then it just worked out that way very nicely. I also have a few illustrations, maps and stuff like that. So it's quite in terms of the format, the form, it's quite innovative. I quite like it, and I'm very happy with it.
Thank you, Yann, for joining us, and we hope to have you on at a later time to discuss your Son of Nobody when it comes out. Thank you very much.
This is Pulse 95.
好，下下。